faculty seminar series for this year is built around the idea of citizenship and social rights, but in particular, we were interested in exploring some of the social rights that seem sort of more marginal to the larger project of the welfare state as it's developed in advanced industrialized economies. And it's, I think, really fitting that we're starting off the series with a talk about disability rights, because disability in some ways is absolutely central to the idea of the welfare state and to the construction of the welfare state. But in other ways, some of the ways that our speaker points out in his paper today, disability has also been systematically marginalized and stigmatized, and has come, I think, to play a more marginal role in the welfare state in the US than many people might have expected at the beginning. So I'm delighted that we could start with this topic, and I'm particularly pleased to introduce today Professor Samuel Bagenstos, who is a professor of law at the University of Michigan, and who is one of the foremost experts on disability rights law in the US. In fact, he literally wrote a book on it. His Disability Rights Law, Cases and Materials, is widely used as a textbook and a reference book for legal scholars and legal practitioners in this area. He's also the author of Law and the Contradictions of the Disability Rights Movement, as well as numerous articles in the country's top law journals. From 2009 to 2011, Professor Bagenstos served as the #2 in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. And while he was there, he oversaw the first comprehensive rewriting of the regulations around the APA. He's also been a frequent testifier in front of Congress on issues related to disability law. So he brings a lot of both scholarly and legal practitioners' expertise to his talk today. I also want to introduce Professor Nancy Hirschmann, who's going to serve as the discussant today. Nancy, in addition to being my fabulous colleague here in the political science department at Penn, is also an expert on the intersection between political theory, feminist theory, and disability, and has been spending much of her time, I would say, in the last probably 6 to 7 years, right, working on the intersection of political theory and disability. She has a forthcoming book authored with Beth Linker in History and Sociology of Science called Civil Disabilities, Theory, Citizenship, and the Body, which is coming out next year, right? Yes, under a different title. An even better title.
Next year. We'll see.
Here, next year?
No, we're looking at our editor.
Oh, okay. So these are two fabulous people to speak to each other, coming from slightly different perspectives, as is our tradition with this series. We like to have a speaker and a discussant who come from different academic and scholarly backgrounds to speak to each other. So we'll have Professor Bagenstos speak for about 20 minutes, and then Nancy will give us 10 to 12 minutes of comments. And I only call her Nancy and him Professor Bagenstos because I know her. You know yourself, you know. Professor Hirschmann.
Yeah, family friendly,
A couple
I could hear your idol.
I don't want to do a Marco Rubio and have to leave that. So,
There's a little cart. Should we bring that closer?
no, I'm good. I'll be good. Thank you. So this is really terrific. I will say I usually speak to law audiences. It's quite intimidating, actually, to speak to an audience of people who have actual disciplines and not just legal training, such as it is. So that doesn't account totally for whatever nervous energy I bring to this. But it's a somewhat intimidating thing to do, but also really exciting. I'm really happy to have the chance to talk about these issues here. I was asked to kind of give 15 to 20 minutes of just sort of what motivated writing this paper, and then what are some sort of highlights and key issues in this paper that I think would be useful to discuss. So let me do that. And so what motivated me to write this, you asked. I mean, that's the basic thing. You asked me to do this. And that's not the only reason I wrote this paper. For the 15 a lot of time dealing with issues of disability and citizenship and social rights, sometimes in those terms, sometimes not. But I've thought a lot about them, I've written a lot about them, and particularly I've written a lot about how the disability rights movement in the United States, mostly, has managed what they've experienced as a tension between social rights and social citizenship. And so when I got this invitation to talk about this, as I was saying at lunch, I usually say no to such invitations. Usually I don't like to be asked to write something that I wasn't already planning to write, but actually I was thinking a lot about these issues and had been thinking a lot about, well, what's sort of my current views about these issues? In part, although this doesn't come out in the paper, prompted by the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, which is an important piece of social rights that is very universal in character, but has important implications for people with disabilities, but also because I hadn't written about this in a while. I was thinking about these issues, so I thought it would be useful to try to pull together thoughts about how the disability rights movement in America had managed the tension between social citizenship and social rights in a single essay. And so what you have is sort of the outcome of that process. And I have three basic pieces to the discussion. So first is kind of setting up the problem. And the problem is in the history of Anglo-American law particularly, and I really, one of the things you might criticize me for quite appropriately is, I'm really very focused on the United States. It's what I know best. It's what I feel most comfortable talking about, and I think there are interesting ways that you could draw on discussions from elsewhere. But in the United States, at least, and in the English law that American law draws on for these purposes, disability has been a key factor in the application of social welfare regimes. It's been a ticket to the receipt of social rights, but it's also been a ticket out of full social citizenship. Social citizenship, sort of the term I use to mean being treated as an equal, a full and equal member of society by society in general. And that's the basic tension of the paper, right? The basic tension of the paper is disability as both a privileged status, but also a status that leads to a denial of full social citizenship. So disability has long been understood as a trigger for poor relief in England and America, and for welfare in the modern American welfare state, for a couple of reasons. One, because it seems like an objective and medicalized category, so we're not so worried about issues of fraud. We think that we're worried about giving poor relief to people. We're worried about giving welfare to people because it undermines work incentives, it undermines the market system. But if people have a medically objectively determinable condition that makes them unable to work, then we're not as concerned about that. And the second reason has to do with issues of fault, that people with disabilities have long been understood to be the deserving poor, sort of the paradigm case of the deserving poor. And so in welfare state systems that try to provide relief to the deserving poor, disability has been a major category for giving relief. Now, I don't mean to be uncritical of this. In fact, a lot of my work is very much critical of this. But that, at least, is the understanding that I think motivates a lot of American law governing welfare and governing disability and welfare. So that makes disability look like a privileged status. But the exemption from the obligation to work to make your way in the world also leads to people being treated like less of a citizen. I talk about this a little bit in the paper. By society in terms of social stigma, and there is a social expectation that people work for a living, and even if people are unable to work for understandable reasons, there are lots of social pressures to treat somebody as not being a full member of society anymore if they are on disability-based welfare. It leads to being treated as less of a citizen by the administration of welfare programs. And so one of the major critiques made by the disability rights movement in England and in the United States, actually, in the 70s and 80s, and 60s, 70s, and 80s, was that welfare administration, the administration of disability benefits programs, was highly paternalistic and intrusive. right? You see this in the welfare rights movement in America more generally, but with a particular edge in the disability rights movement. And sometimes accepting social rights, social welfare, leads to being treated as less of an equal citizen by law. So there's the history of disenfranchisement, but also guardianship often gets triggered by decisions to grant welfare benefits, disability welfare benefits, the representative payee system in American Social Security disability law, which gives a third party substantial financial control over the lives of people who receive Social Security disability in many cases, right? So sometimes by law, people who receive social rights, social welfare benefits on the basis of disability are treated as less than full citizens, often by administration and nearly always by society as a whole. So this means that disability seems like a privileged status, but it's also a problematic one. It's also, disability is a ticket to receiving social rights, but it's also a ticket out of social citizenship. And I think this problematizes, a word I hate to use, I've been back in the academy 2 years plus, and I'm already talking like a damn academic. I'm sorry. This makes the argument that you often see about social rights sort of coming from T.H. Marshall, this idea of social rights as affirming full social citizenship, much more complicated, much more problematic. And so I've always been interested in disability in this way, and in the way that the American disability rights movement really focused on this problem, really focused on the tension between the social rights that are attendant to disability, the social welfare benefits people receive because of disability, and the fact that accepting those rights leads to a denial of social citizenship, of full social citizenship. So I talk in the paper about two possible strategies, two ways of addressing and managing this tension. Right? So one strategy of managing this tension is not the disability rights movement's strategy, but it is the time-honored strategy of the designers of social welfare programs in the United States and elsewhere, which is the strategy of universalism and universal social insurance. As a way of trying to affirm the equal social citizenship of those who receive social welfare benefits. This is the idea. You understand why this idea works, right? You understand why this idea is appealing. This idea is appealing both in terms of the argument you can make for it and in terms of at least some, although mixed, empirical evidence. So the argument is that the message of universal contributory social welfare systems is, look, it's not something that we give to people who we pick out as being especially deserving. It's something that everybody's entitled to. It's a message of reciprocity. Right? We all pay into Social Security, and we all hopefully will live long enough that we can use Social Security. And Social Security, even in its old age variant, even in the original Social Security, was significantly a disability insurance program. It wasn't framed that way. Disability was not a category that was used in the administration of the program until 1956 when it was explicitly added. But it was about disability. It was about the fact that people grow old and grow unable to work because of the disabilities attendant to aging, right? And the idea behind Social Security in the United States was, look, we all pay in, we all participate, and then we all get the benefits that are owed to us. It was a message of reciprocity. And you can see a similar message extending to explicitly disability-based programs like Social Security disability insurance, right? The idea that we all pay into Social Security disability insurance. Any one of us might get a disability that keeps us from working before the normal retirement age and need this sort of form of early retirement. And so we all are entitled to participate in this reciprocal program. So the message is one that's understood to affirm the social citizenship, the equal social citizenship of the people who receive benefits. You know, there's some huge, obviously, empirical debates in the United States and elsewhere about whether framing social welfare programs in these kind of universalist social insurance terms actually protects them against political attacks, actually makes them less vulnerable in administration. And there's a lot one can say about that. I've written various things about that. All I'd say is that there's at least some reason to believe that when you have universal social insurance programs, that they are less politically vulnerable, and they are less vulnerable to kind of being nickel and dimed in the administration, and less vulnerable to stigmatizing their recipients. But at the end of the day, this strategy is of limited use for people with disabilities because people with disabilities, because of their disability, a status that everybody, again, just like age, everybody, if we live long enough and are lucky enough, we will eventually go into the status of disability, just like we will eventually go into the status of old age. But people don't believe that. People are in denial about that. So the status of disability remains highly stigmatized, unlike the status of old age. And so you have people, because of this stigmatized status, receiving an exemption from the ordinary opportunity to work that feeds the underlying stigma, that leads to the denial of both social and, in some cases, juridical citizenship in ways that I've talked about. So even when you have a universal social insurance program like Social Security Disability Insurance, as we have seen in recent media controversies, which I talk about in the paper, but I could have talked about 100 media controversies. I could have talked about a number of legislative controversies throughout the years. The explicit disability framing of these programs makes them continue to be very vulnerable and continue to threaten in significant ways the equal social citizenship of the people who receive them. So one problem with universalism and universal social insurance as a strategy is it in fact doesn't insulate the disability-based recipients of social welfare benefits from the kind of stigma and denial of social citizenship that even that more explicit disability-based relief does, exposes them to. And also another limitation is universal social insurance is itself of limited utility to provide people with disabilities what people with disabilities need for full and equal participation in society as a whole, right? So what Social Security Disability Insurance, the paradigmatic program, does is it pays people not to work. But in order to obtain full participation in society, requires not just being paid to sit in some room somewhere and not work, but actually lots of social investments to enable people with disabilities to get into the workplace and work. Some of these are workplace accommodations, but others of these are just really standard kinds of social investments in assistive technology services, in accessible transportation, and healthcare. In all sorts of things that require substantial outlay of money that might be very significantly disability-based, but can't really be understood as just universal social insurance. So it's a limitation in terms of the goals, and I haven't been explicit about this, but in terms of the goals of what a disability rights movement might appropriately want, or what people with disabilities might appropriately want. Full and equal citizenship, meaning participation in society. So then the last thing I talk about in the paper is a sort of second strategy for managing the tensions between social rights and social citizenship in the context of disability, and that is the strategy of the American disability rights movement, which is a strategy that focuses on the ideal, and really the word, independence, right? The idea that what we're trying to promote here is independent living, the ability to participate fully in society, to make an individual's own choices, and have those choices be effective in society. And to think about what the goal is as providing the investments, the social investments necessary to enable people with disabilities to work in society, to participate in all the ways everyone else participates in society, to carry their own weight, but with the support of various kinds of social interventions. So I've written elsewhere that if you really read deeply in what folks in the American disability rights movement were saying in the 70s and 80s, it's this odd combination of a very libertarian-sounding rhetoric with a very social democratic political program. So the rhetoric is all individualism, individual choice, free me from welfare, I don't want to be on welfare, I don't want to be on the dole, but let's have very substantial social investments in order to permit individuals with disabilities to do that. And this was a very successful, it seems odd, right? It seems strange as a juxtaposition, but a very successful political move for the disability rights movement in America, both in the 1980s, in the early part of the 1980s, in fighting off cuts to disability-based welfare, interestingly, but even more so in obtaining the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a comprehensive disability civil rights law which guarantees not just non-discrimination, but also very extensive and often costly accommodations in workplaces, in businesses, in schools, in every institution in American society. And more recently, it's been a very useful argumentative frame and political resource for disability rights advocates in obtaining state investments in robust community-based service provision systems for people with various kinds of disabilities. The argument that seems to be the most effective one here being largely a fiscal one, right? Largely a dollars and cents one. This sort of falls in the general category of business cases for non-discrimination or for civil rights. The argument is, look, in the passage of the ADA, you have $300 million you're spending a year on disability welfare. Wouldn't it be much better if these people weren't sitting at home taking money, but were in fact in the workplace earning money, paying taxes? And yes, that's going to cost some money, but it's going to cost a lot less than we're going to gain. Financially, there's also a significant moral aspect to the argument as well, that there's a welfare mentality that's been developed among people with disabilities, and the leading spokespeople of the disability rights movement in the 70s and 80s spoke explicitly in those terms. What we need is a mentality of doing it for yourself, and then redefining doing it for yourself to include getting various kinds of support and making the choices of living your life. So this has been a very successful strategy, but again, it's a very limited one. It's limited by two things, right? If you think about the fiscal argument depends on there being an underlying willingness of American society at the baseline to pay substantial amounts for disability welfare. And it depends on the interventions that people with disabilities are asking for being cheaper than whatever that baseline amount that the American society is willing to pay is. And I think both of those conditions are changing in ways that make it difficult to see this fiscal argument, this independence-based argument, being as successful in the future as it has been in the past for people with disabilities. I will admit, in the 15 minutes while I was waiting to come down here for this talk, I was following obsessively my Twitter feed to see what was going on in the latest negotiations in Washington. Obviously we will not breach the debt ceiling, or we will do so only briefly, but I think it's emblematic of a kind of politics, right? The fact that we have these substantial cuts to domestic spending and the sequester, which are going to continue. The fact that the basic terms of debate about how we're going to resolve fiscal issues long-term involve cuts to so-called entitlements. What are entitlements? Well, the biggest, the most expensive and growing entitlements are disability-based entitlements, right? I mean, they're the healthcare entitlements for people with serious health conditions, otherwise known as disabilities. And in the Social Security area, Social Security disability is growing and growing for lots of reasons that I'm happy to get into and that are, in my view, good and perfectly appropriate reasons. But if there is a political push to cut entitlements, what that really means is a lack of political desire to continue funding the disability welfare state to the level we have. So less desire to fund disability welfare, and on the other side of the equation, the interventions that are now required for people with disabilities to obtain further integration in society. Right, we've done very successfully with increasing employment for certain classes of people with disabilities, people who don't need very expensive interventions. The people who are still not employed who have disabilities often require quite expensive interventions in order to get into the workforce. They can then be very productive workers for their employers, but the cost, the marginal cost of integrating more people with disabilities fully into society is greater now. And so, given a lack of desire to spend and an increase in cost, I think this argument isn't going to work as well. So I began with, here's this tension. There's this tension between social rights and social citizenship for people with disabilities, which is a different kind of argument than you see in the standard argument about social rights, and the T.H. Marshall argument about social rights is vindicating citizenship. I talked about these ways in which various folks who have promoted social rights for people with disabilities have been attentive to and try to manage this tension in a way that promotes social citizenship while still providing social rights for people with disabilities. And I end on sort of a pessimistic note, which is I think that these are going to be increasingly tough times for people like me who are advocating in the political arena for increased social provision and increased social rights for people with disabilities. So thanks very much, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
I've heard the last name pronounced 3 different ways in the past 25 minutes. Is Bagenstos the correct pronunciation?
Bagenstos.
Bagenstos?
Yes, but whatever, call me
I'm
whatever.
not going to say your last name.
Sam is good.
Sam. So thanks to Sam for giving us such an interesting paper. The topic of disability is obviously a very important one that people in various social sciences are finally turning to, well behind our colleagues in English and history, sociology, and science. The paper provides a good overview and narrative of the state of disability social rights and provides a helpful analysis of why they've been so inadequate in helping disabled persons integrate fully into the polity as full citizens. And I think the account of the problems of disability social rights is clear and correct. I agree with much of it, particularly the notion that these rights are seen as an alternative to citizenship rights, such that accessing these rights compromises citizenship rather than reinforcing it. And I think the paper provides a good overview of the poor laws and of the ways in which disability and poverty have always been intertwined, largely because the majority of disabled persons are either not able or not permitted to work. Whatever moral status we have rightly or wrongly attributed to work as the mark of citizenship, it's clear that in capitalist America, not earning a paycheck generally entails poverty. But I do want to raise just 5 points where I'm either not clear or I want to question your argument that might serve as a takeoff for discussion. I first want to consider Sam's claim that disability social rights go back to Elizabethan poor law. I think Stone is wrong there. Certainly benefits for disabled persons were provided under the auspices of the poor law of the 16th century into the 17th. But it's more the language of charity, responsibility, and duty, particularly, rather than rights. And later, of course, the language of fraud, as Locke enters the debate, particularly fraudulent beggars, a discourse that continues into the 19th century, ugly laws, which made it illegal for disabled persons to appear in public. Now, maybe that shouldn't be surprising, since the language of rights doesn't really enter into everyday thinking about citizenship for anyone until the end of the 17th century and really into the 18th. And even then, disabled persons are not really generally included in such conceptual language because they were likened to children and minors, especially intellectually disabled persons, and hence they could not be rights bearers. Now, that might seem like a technical point, it's a minor point, certainly, in the context of the paper, but it leads to a second and bigger question. Are disability rights, as they currently exist, really rights in the first place at all? Sam acknowledges at the very start of the paper that social rights have different status, and I wonder whether whole labeling of these as rights in the first place isn't part of the problem. Whether they might be called something else, like, for instance, you talk about the term entitlements, and I know that we tend to collapse the two, even calling things like Social Security, disability, entitlement rights. But I want to suggest that maybe the two ideas should be seen as conceptually distinct. For instance, the paper talks about welfare or public assistance for poor mothers. Most people don't really view that as a right, but as an entitlement that is based on need, specifically the need to care for children without a male breadwinner. Need is always a political construction, because it is always links to desert, and desert is subjective and discretionary. The language of the deserving and undeserving poor goes back to those Elizabethan poor laws that you mentioned, and carries through to the pillorying of welfare queens in the 1980s and 1990s that you briefly referenced. and the rise of punitive workfare laws and family caps. But that means it's not really a right in the Dworkian sense of a trumping claim against others. Rights are not discretionary, that's their whole point. Entitlements, as I'm suggesting that we use the term, always entails specific knowledge about the subject who claims the entitlement, whereas rights are by their nature more universal and impersonal, I'm suggesting. Entitlements are requests for assistance, special treatment, which requires you to know who's doing the asking. In this sense, one might suggest that Social Security old age insurance is not an entitlement, even though we call it that, but rather a right that is completely independent of need. Many people receive Social Security who don't need it. They have generous pensions or 401ks or even a salary. By contrast, for SSDI, even though you can't receive it unless you pay into the system, as Sam notes, receiving such payments is not dependent exclusively on that paying in. You still have to establish that because of your disability, you can't work, as the paper notes. So I suggest that the demonization of SSDI that is related to the paper stems from the fact that it's not a right at all, but just a different kind of anti-poverty needs-based program. The need, in this case, may not be strictly economic, but of course in the vast majority of cases, SSDI ensures that it will become an economic need. This leads to my third question or suggestion for the paper. I think that this problem of separating out entitlements, which are needs-based, from rights, which are not, helps explain the failure of one of the most obvious pieces of legislation that one must think of when considering disability rights, and that's, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's something that you mention in the paper, but don't talk about a lot, and I wonder if you might consider including more of it in the paper, particularly since you want to argue that we might view workplace accommodation as a social right. The ADA was, of course, a landmark piece of legislation that really tried to establish disability rights as Trump-like claims against corporations and governments to provide for democratic access. Here we find the true linking of rights with citizenship, because the ADA was all about, as Dr. Stenbrook put it, the right to live in the world, to use common carriers, to enter public buildings, to use public restrooms, to hold a job, to take vacations, to raise a family, and so forth. The ADA deployed the social model of disability, the idea that what causes a disability is not a particular individual's body, but rather a social environment, including architectural and physical space, attitudes, customs, and practices that favor certain kinds of bodies and are hostile to others. It's not that my legs don't work and so I use a wheelchair that causes my disability. It's the lack of an elevator and ramps and curb cuts and wide enough doorways. It's not my hearing impairment that disables me. It's my employer's failure to install appropriate telephone technology. On the social model view, the argument for disability rights is that society disables certain bodies, so society has an obligation to compensate the persons who have those bodies. So the ADA was really quite radical. But even so, it largely failed to change things for many disabled workers, thanks to Supreme Court's interpretation in the landmark cases Toyota versus Williams and Sutton v. United Airlines, which clearly set out the court's interpretation of the term disability to mean unable to work, which created a catch-22 for disabled plaintiffs seeking accommodation so that they could work. Now, since the paper argues that SSDI and SSI do that as well, defining disability as unable to work, I wonder why you don't take that up in the paper. It seems to me that the court really bent over backwards to deny disabled people the rights that Congress intended, which was to support accommodation that would allow people to work. Indeed, it was the court's almost willful ableism that resulted in passage of the ADA Amendments Act just a few years ago. And I wonder if the argument that workplace accommodation should be a social right might in fact be made moot by the ADA Amendment Act, because it may have turned workplace accommodation into a real right, with a legal right with teeth. And of course, only time will tell. My fourth question then follows from this. Why do we want to hold on to the idea of calling these things social rights in the first place? And you seem to indicate that you want to do that in the last section of the paper. Why not just abandon the idea of social rights altogether and talk about them in terms of civil rights, right? You say on page 1 that there's been a trend to move toward a civil rights model and away from social rights. So why is it important to hold on to the idea of social rights? What do we gain by that? You argue that social rights weaken a person's citizenship, But maybe it's worse than that. Maybe social rights are created for people who already are deemed non-citizens. That is, you don't lose your citizenship when you access SSDI, you lost it when you have that car accident and the use of your legs. If you were born with one arm, you were born a non-citizen, or at least a second-class one, just as women still are in many parts of the world not citizens simply by virtue of being born female. That's what SSI is for, non-citizens. I confess that I've always thought that the whole schema of setting up this distinct category of social rights to be somewhat suspect, because the things designated as social rights, such as subsistence income, are not in fact social. They are always already political. Now, as Marx taught us from the left, not being able to earn a living wage is the most political problem that humans face in capitalist society. And keeping disabled persons out of the workforce is political enough to have led a conservative Republican Congress and George W. Bush to enact the ADA Amendment Act. So I worry that there's a certain, short-sightedness in setting aside these kinds of economic rights as social rights. What do we gain, again, by holding on to the topology? Republican politics brings me to my final comment about the notion of independence as a strategy to gain more support for disability rights, which follows the disability movement's efforts as well, and something that Sam talks about. I agree that there's an instrumental advantage to this in the age of personal responsibility, workfare, and sequestration, and I agree that with Sam's arguments that its effect is limited. But I also think that there's a long-term effect to that is potentially self-contradictory. Feminists like Martha Feynman have argued the stress on independence is problematic in its ignorance of the ways in which human beings are intrinsically interdependent, and that we are inevitably dependent on other people throughout our lives. The concern with independence is, in her view, a fantasy that gets in the way of more accurate and creative ways of developing public policies that can address the real social problems that we face. What disability does is make this dependence obvious. So rather than argue that disabled persons should try to follow a liberal individualist mythology of dependence, perhaps, excuse me, Feynman's argument could help us instead point out that disability rights are based on the inevitability of human dependence. And this could tie to the notions of universal social assurance. But the universality has to be seen as a universality of need, not contribution. As disability scholars like to say, we are all disabled, if not now, then eventually. The universality of disability, if you'll forgive a problematic language, the idea that we are really disabled, just like them, rather than that they are independent, just like us, right, could hold, I think, more radical potential, and I'm not making any assessments about who is disabled in this room. I think that could hold more radical potential for disability rights. And I think at least the fact of dependence is something that we should keep in mind.
That's great. So thank you. And these are really helpful comments. I love when somebody says, I have just 5 points, because I usually give just 2 points. 5 is not just, but unjust. So the first point I just take as an entirely friendly amendment. I mean, I certainly, the idea that disability social rights go back to the poor laws is certainly not framed in rights terms. It's certainly framed in charity terms. And, as you say, it's a pre-rights concept. What I think is useful about that history is more that disability has been this on-ramp to getting something special, but this off-ramp from citizenship for a long time. And I think so I don't really have much to disagree with that. I do think, so there are a lot of interesting conceptual questions, Nancy, that you raise, and about how we think about what rights are, about how we think about the relationship between rights and politics, about how we think about the relationship between rights and societies, and how we think about society, and how we think about different typologies of rights, and do they define something that's pre-existing in the world or not? And I guess my basic view about this is I understand I mean, I teach students what Dworkin says about rights as trumps and the idea of rights as being universal, general versus particular. They're not individuated. That's a conception of rights a lot of people have. I just don't buy it. I mean, so I think rights are inherently political. I think every right is limited by circumstances. I think, name a right for me that is a Dworkin right, and I will tell you all of the various ways in which it rests on what's really a political compromise of various interests. And I think that's true here. I think what's important about disability, are disability rights really rights? And are the kinds of social welfare interests that we're talking about really rights? I mean, I think there's certainly something important that actors in the political and legal process think they gain by framing them as rights. And I think that's something that's important here. But I mean, to me, it's almost not an intelligible question to say, are they really rights? I mean, they're really rights if the political and legal system accepts them as rights. They have certain characteristics that that are understood as rights. Of course, entitlement, I mean, for a lawyer, entitlement actually sounds a lot like a right. So when you talk about an entitlement, that's something an individual is entitled to. But I think that just highlights how much of this is really about linguistics and much more about politics, about the political power that attaches to particular words. And calling something a right in America is powerful. And so it's not surprising that you'd have the disability movement really coalescing on being a disability rights movement in America in a way that they don't call themselves in other countries, right? So I think that's interesting. But I think you're absolutely correct that the demonization of SSDI is because it's not understood as a right. It's understood as an anti-poverty, need-based program. I would just suggest that we sometimes frame such things as rights, and sometimes that framing is successful. So I think the real point of disagreement I might have, and I think that's also true about the civil rights, social rights distinction. Why not call it civil right? Well, obviously, I mean, a big part of my argument is the disability rights movement has tried to frame these things that lots of people think of as social rights as being really civil rights. And it's a political contest, and they've succeeded to some extent. Lots of the stuff that the ADA requires, that we think of in terms of a civil right, has at other times been thought of as something more like a social right, more discretionary, more dependent on whether there are resources available. Certainly thinking, in the city of Philadelphia, which had major litigation about accessibility of sidewalks, when Ed Randell made his national name opposing the ADA because it was so expensive. And the court said it doesn't matter how expensive it is. When you resurface the street, you have to provide curb cuts. Even though Ed Randell said, as mayor, this is going to be an enormous percentage of our budget every year. That was a moment when the civil rights framing won out, but it was very much in contest, right? And Randell and Ed Koch, 20 years earlier in a similar lawsuit in New York before him, were arguing this is really a social right. So I think these are very contested, and I don't disagree. I don't disagree as to why they're contested, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it matters so much. I mean, for my purposes, what you call them, but I think it matters in the polity. It matters in our society. The real point that I might have some disagreement is on thinking about the so-called failure of the ADA. And I think we really need to unpack what we mean by the failure of the ADA. The ADA, and so I think the ADA has succeeded in many ways, and it has not succeeded in others. So it succeeded immensely in promoting the visibility of individuals with disability in American society. So there are many more people with disabilities in in not just workplaces, but in schools, in shopping malls, in all of the places that we all go, at the baseball game, everywhere that you go in society, in jury boxes, in voting booths, than there were before the ADA, and that's about the ADA. And I think that's very significant. When I have international graduate students come in, graduate students with disabilities come from other countries, they see America as paradise, and it's really useful for me because I get very down about how well we do about disability stuff in America. But I think they're so happy we have an ADA, and they see the results of it every day. So I think that's important. Where the ADA hasn't worked is in employment, and mean, I've written in my Law and Contradictions book, I actually have a discussion about, was it the Supreme Court that made the ADA fail with respect to employment? And I think not, actually. I disagree with the Supreme Court decisions. I testified in favor of the ADA Amendments Act in Congress. I think those decisions were wrong. But I don't think those decisions are why the ADA hasn't improved employment. If you look at what those decisions did, they reduced the coverage of the ADA to people who had disabilities that made them significantly limited in the ability to work, basically. And if you look at the statistics, as far as employment statistics for people with disabilities, disaggregated by type of disability before and after the enactment of the ADA, it's the people who have disabilities that don't make them unable to work. So the people who would be excluded from ADA coverage by these decisions that actually did a lot better after the enactment of the ADA. It's the people who had disabilities that affected their ability to work who did worse. So I don't think you can say it's the definition of disability decisions that really caused the problem. I think there were a lot of things leading to the problem. The best analysis, I think, is you get the ADA, it gets enacted in 1990, you get a recession a year later, and the recession interacts with a broadening of eligibility for SSDI that happened in the 1980s to mean lots of people with disabilities leave the workforce and get into SSDI, and once you get on, you don't get off, right? And so I actually think that these are complicated problems, but I don't necessarily disagree with some of the discussion. I do think also, I of course totally agree that the independence frame of the disability rights movement is really limited and problematic. One of the things that I've tried to do in my writing, but also in my work with disability rights activists, is try to get people off of that, because I think it is very limited, and I think it buys into something that is a problem for people with disabilities and for disability rights activists. But it's very powerful among disability rights activists, among politically active people with disabilities, and I think it's important to understand why. We live in an American society where universality of need doesn't cut a lot of political ice, whereas personal independence and responsibility does. And so these are constant political, tactical, strategic choices that a movement is making. So I think one place that my paper can very much be critiqued is, and I read a lot of these criticisms in that light, is I sort of don't decide whether I stand inside or outside of those political strategic judgments that the disability rights movement in America has made. And so I sometimes kind of play both sides of that, which we're going to do here. Anyway, but I thought these were really helpful comments, and I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking about them as I revise this paper, so thanks. So I guess I have questions, and I know some of you have to leave at 1. All I'm going to ask is if you leave in the middle, make sure you leave right after I say something and make it look like you're really mad at me, so and maybe I can make that.
Yeah, I just have a couple of little sort of add-ons. First, I'm very puzzled by the disability movement's rhetoric that to try to latch or mimic this sort of social security rhetoric that we're all going to, if we wait long enough, we'll all be disabled someday. I think that's simply a false statement. There are people who never become disabled. And I think it tries to paper over the growing component in disability, which is self-inflicted. So, obviously the disability rights people want this all to be seen as sort of aleatory and due to misfortune, but I think I guess I would ask you to address the sense that a lot of disability now is related to obesity or to lifestyle choices and the like. Secondly, everybody says, well, SSDI is stigmatized because it's a poverty program. I think it's stigmatized more and more because there's a very strong sense that it's being abused. And I think that's actually part of what's bedeviling disability programs generally. If you saw the recent 60 Minutes segment, which of course everybody was extremely up in arms about, I think this is a growing problem. Finally, I wanted to make a comment about dependency. So Martha Feynman and her like have been saying forever, well, we're all dependent, we're all in need, so dependency should just be seen as the human condition. Well, I think it's really time to retire that point, because the common sense response is it's a matter of degree and it's a matter of type. I mean, some people are far more dependent than others, and some people do far more to minimize their dependency than others. There's dysfunctional dependency, and then there's functional and positive dependency, and I think ordinary people make those distinctions. I guess you could call that political. But those distinctions are really critical.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, so this is all helpful. I mean, and I guess what I would say is it's all sort of examples. Everything you're saying is an example of the dynamic that I'm talking about in the paper. So I don't know. We could talk for a long time about the question of do some people never become disabled? I think this gets back to the question of the social model of disability. What does disability really mean? Every single person, 100% of human beings, if they don't get hit by a bus at a young age, will experience some incompatibility between some physical or mental capacity of theirs and some institution they deal with, right? And so in a kind of social model of disability way, 100% of people will be disabled in that sense. And in fact, pretty darn close to 100% of people will need quite substantial accommodations at various points in their lives if they're going to continue to participate fully. But that's an empirical argument that we should have. So the question of disabilities that are self-inflicted, and so I was wondering where you're going with self-inflicted, and then so it's obesity. I talk about this a little bit in the paper, right? Because one of the hopes of the disability category as a way of providing access to benefits is it's objective and there's no fault attached to disability. And of course, actually, you can start asking lots of questions about whether people are at fault for lots of their conditions. So my son, who was born with a disability, okay, he's not at fault for his disability, although again, we might start asking questions, well, is he managing it, right? Is he doing something to diminish his dependency on other people, right? But then most of us who develop disabilities over the course of a lifetime, you can point to some degree of choices. And I guess what I'd say about that is, it's a highly political judgment, right? What we're going to decide counts as self-inflicted. So what are the individual choices that contribute to disability that we're going to say disentitle one from some kind of social provision? And the reason why we're asking, I think, is precisely because giving people exemptions from the ordinary requirements of citizenship is itself something we find very questionable. And for it's not. I don't mean to criticize that. If you take a world in which you say, look, people have to work for a living as the baseline, and then you say, but some people don't have to work for a living, of course we're going to question it. And I think that's the basis of the disability rights movement's critique of welfare and cash benefits is exactly that. And I think it's the same thing about SSDI, and it's the same thing about dependency. All of the things that you're pointing out are, in my view, just proving that the disability rights movement is right to be concerned that when we have a system that gives people exemptions just because they prove they have a disability, that's going to make the disability category highly subject to question. Yeah.
I have two questions I want to put to you. One has to do with the sources of stigma. Where does stigma come from? And I think you talk about some of those sources in the paper, but not others. And I was curious as to why that was. So you talk a little bit about the stigma that comes from simply being attached to the welfare state, one way or another. And you talk about the stigma that comes from inability / perhaps unwillingness to work and to participate fully in the labor market. But you don't really address stigma that arises directly from people's disabilities. So the stigma that arises directly from, for example, mental illness, you don't discuss in the paper. And it seems to me that really the paper is revolving around how we as a society deal with stigmatized conditions. So I'd like to hear more about that. The other thought that I had, as someone who really studies other welfare states more than our own, was the link between disability and the labor market, which is very, very explicit in many European welfare states. adverse labor market. And it seems to me that in U.S. debates about disability, there's less of a willingness to engage openly with the idea that use of disability benefits might be linked to conditions in the labor market, but that other aspects of disability policy should be considered as quite separate from the labor market. So I'm not quite sure what the question there is.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great issue. So yeah, and I think, as I was sort of thinking through how I present this, your first question, what's the contribution to stigma of just disability itself? I realized I was taking a lot of that as a given when I was writing the paper, right? And so I wasn't really, but of course that's right. And of course, a big part of what's going on here is this is an already stigmatized condition. These are already stigmatized conditions. Where do those stigmas come from? I mean, obviously there's a lot of work on that through the years. And I think it depends on the kind of disability in some ways. I think, so lots of psychological theories about that. I think in light of the conversation, the colloquy I just had with Amy, I mean, I think, one of the arguments that's most appealed to me is there's sort of a psychological denial thing going on. You see a person with a disability, you don't want to believe that could be you, but of course it could be any of us any day. And so there are, we want to believe that we can avoid that, and that's, I think, a significant contributor to the stigma of disability. But I also think dependence itself. I mean, disability has for a long time been tied to dependence, right? And so I think that's part of it. But I think that those are really interesting issues, and I should definitely say more about them. The link between disability and labor market is really, really interesting too. So one of the points that appears in this paper is the recent discussion about SSDI. So the 60 Minutes episode, the earlier NPR story, and various other recent fights about SSDI. One of the gotcha points that they all present is, look, SSDI rolls went way up when the economy went down. And that proves it's not disability going on here. It proves it's something else. It's true in America, right? I mean, if you look, every time the economy goes into recession since 1956, SSDI rolls go up. This actually shouldn't be that surprising, right? It shouldn't be that surprising even if you have the very traditional understanding of what SSDI is for as a kind of early retirement for people who have acquired the disability of age early and therefore no longer have labor market opportunities because, when there are a lot of people seeking few jobs, employers aren't going to hire the people who have physical conditions that make them less desirable than other workers, whereas in times when the labor market is tight, they will, right? I mean, so that's actually just not, it shouldn't be at all surprising that when disability is defined in significant ways in terms of ability to work, that ability to work is going to vary based on economic and labor market conditions, but there's a substantial political refusal to see that, okay, in America. And I think in other places it seemed differently. One problem is, and I think this is a policy problem of SSDI, but which has also been a problem in other countries, is, if it were something like extended unemployment where people go on SSDI rolls and then go off when the economy got better, I think you'd have less of it, right? But the problem is people go on SSDI rolls and then the economy gets better and they stay on SSDI. And part of that is about, it's been a long time, they've been out of the workforce for a while. Part of that is about how our SSDI program is designed. Basically, you can't get on SSDI until you've been out of work for 2 years, and you have to go through a lot to prove you really can't work at all in order to get SSDI. At that point, it's really hard to get back into the swing of the workforce. But I think if we could solve that policy problem, that might make some difference. So, the Netherlands had this huge problem that was exactly the same, that they seem to have made substantial efforts towards solving. If we were to do stuff like that here, highly controversial, that might well change the politics of this. But I totally agree with you about the political dynamic. Yeah.
Well, my question is a version of the previous ones, but I want to put it a little differently. My thesis supervisor, Judith Schlar, wrote a book on American citizenship in which he said there are two big symbols of what makes you a full and equal citizen. The vote and the job, work. And that suggests that one argument, which is that when it comes to stigma, what we're seeing now in regard to the disabled turns almost entirely on those who can't work or can't work without enormous expenditures. So that's stigmatized. The evidence about the impact of the ADA gave that well, if you are working, the other kinds of accommodations carry less stigma over time. And so maybe the issues of stigma now are really just part of our larger concern about whether we believe society and government has a role in making it possible for people to work, and we're reluctant to invest too much in that. Maybe it's all about work on the one hand, but then I'm also conscious of the fact that the accusation that people are unwilling to work often is a false allegation driven by other kinds of stigma. We don't like immigrants, we don't like certain mission-like minorities, and we say, that they're not willing to work. And so that might suggest that the focus on work is just the respectable way of expressing disregard for the disabled for a whole variety of other reasons. And it may not be possible to disentangle these things, but I'd be interested in hearing.
Yeah, I mean, so it may not be, so it's very difficult to disentangle those things. I think that's right, and over time, especially, right? So when I'm just not sure. I think you can point to examples of people with disabilities who are stigmatized even though they are working, right? And even in a workplace setting. But it is in fact true that, to the extent I've seen the social psychological studies of this, when you have people with disabilities working in a workplace for a long period of time, the stereotypes about them decrease. And there may be broader stigmas that are still there, but among their coworkers, they decrease, which suggests that the work is a substantial part of this. But it's also true that that for non-disabled coworkers, stereotypes about other people with disabilities decrease too, right? So it could just be familiarity. I mean, it could be just when sort of traditional contact hypothesis, when people are working together, they start to see people as individuals instead of as groups, right? So I find it really difficult to disentangle, but I think that, and that does go back sort of to Julia's question, that there's a lot of, one question is how much of it is that people are getting taken out of the workforce, and how much of it is that they're getting taken out of the workforce for a condition that's already highly stigmatized. And I'm not sure I have a great answer.
I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on if your interpretation of this, kind of the social rights versus social citizens being in tension, would it be any different for veterans, U.S. veterans? And this thought comes to mind because, in this course of this conversation, we've been talking about stigma, they're going on the dole, or, SSDI, the use of SSDI. Whereas, I think quite the contrary happens when you look at disabled veterans. A lot of them who have disabilities and could get disability do not do it. So I'm just wondering if have you looked into that? Have you thought about?
Yeah, so that's a different perspective than I was thinking. It's a different way than I was thinking you were going. So, I mean, right, there are two different angles on this. Right? One is sort of what's the social attitude toward veterans with disabilities who are on disability benefits. And, the answer to that is, I think the common wisdom is veterans programs are harder to cut than disability programs in general, though it's hard to cut disability programs too. And so in the political sphere, there's a lot of cachet of being a veteran and being a program for veterans. But individual veterans who rely on veterans benefits for a long period of time and who aren't working, face a very similar kind of stigma. But then you're asking a slightly different question, which is those people, from the perspective of the people who, these are people with disabilities as well, but people with disabilities that derive from service, military service, do they make different choices about whether to seek benefits and whether to stay in the workforce? I don't know, but that's a great question. I'd really like to know more about that. Yeah.
Following in part on Julia's question, the NPR piece that you mentioned kind of makes makes a kind of interesting claim, right? Which is that essentially the labor market in the US has fundamentally changed in the last 15 to 20 years with globalization. And so we see a different structure of the labor force, and that SSDI is kind of responding to that in pieces. And I wonder, just wanted to push you a little bit to say, are they right in a certain way? Do we see in kind of SSDI a different shift than you saw in other downturns, right? I mean, I think the downturn point is very clear, and you kind of make that argument of looking back at history, this is very clear. But is it fundamentally different to say somebody is disabled because there isn't a job they can find, where when 15 years ago there was a job they could find, their body may not have changed, but the economy has changed, or the labor market has changed, and does that tell us anything about kind of rights that would follow on?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a great question, and I think it's one of these, it's difficult for me to disentangle. I don't fully know the answer. I think, though, it's true that, there have been major shifts in the economy, but there were major shifts in the kinds of jobs available in the economy, in the 1970s and 1980s as well. And so I'm not, I would hesitate to say that what you see, and certainly when you look at the patterns of disabilities that are getting people onto SSDI, they're not particularly different. Ever since SSDI was narrowed in the early 80s and then broadened again in the mid 80s because Congress didn't like what happened when eligibility was narrowed, you've seen this increase in people getting on SSDI because of pain and because of mental illness, which are understood as difficult to diagnose conditions and somewhat fuzzy in the diagnosis, so susceptible to expanding when it gets hard for people to find jobs. And that's not any different now than it was in the '91 recession. So I don't think that's any different. I think it does raise a very important question, right? Which is, and again gets back to Julie's question, what's the degree to which we're relying on disability programs as our one remaining program of assistance for people who are left behind as the economy changes. And the economy's changed many times throughout history. We used to have other kinds of programs to deal with that, and we just we cut a lot of them. And I think we are relying on it to an enormous amount now, and that's why, that's one of the reasons why you see this political tension. It's the mismatch between the program sold as providing for people with disabilities, but what it really looks like is it's just a safety net program of a kind that we've mostly gotten rid of and don't feel willing to sell overtly, right? So I think that's definitely a piece of what's going on.
I have, this is a very insightful and illuminating discussion, and I'd say the same about Nancy's comments, actually. And so it leaves too many issues that I'd like to bring up. So I'll make a few points and you can decide which you'd like to follow up. I think what struck me in terms of the way you framed this is that you started out by talking about tensions and limitations in the way that people talk about these things, social rights, based on T.H. Marshall's discussion and second and third hand emanations of it. One of the things that struck me is that many of the tensions you talk about are already there in Marshall's discussion, partly in terms of his actual argument as opposed to the way that people make with it, partly in terms of the limitations of his argument. Now, the limitations include the fact, which in different ways both you and Nancy brought up, I've always thought that there was a problem with putting the way Marshall tried to put his argument in terms of sorting out and multiplying different kinds of rights. I think there are problems with that. I think it is true. I've often tried to figure out, is there another term we can use for, let's say, normatively structured expectations and obligations other than rights? I'm not sure entitlements doesn't, whatever. However, the real problem is this, that it's not just a question of multiplying discrete rights, especially social rights, which frankly are just a residual category in Marshall's discussion and remain so. It's more, what Marshall is really saying is there's a kind of long-term historical sociology there in which he says a lot of these kinds of normatively structured expectations and obligations one finds in pre-modern societies, but they're always bound up with hierarchy and obligation, including asymmetric mutual obligations. So they necessarily involve inequality, and they necessarily involve dependence and so on. And then there is a movement, as they used to say, from society based on status to ones based on contract. And the development of contract goes together with the emergence of, he would put it quite this way, market society and the ideology of market society with liberal individualism and so on, in which these kinds of things go away. And then there's the attempt to bring back some of these ideas, but now attached to status instead of contract. That is to say, that you have now a uniform and equal status based on full membership in a community based on citizenship. And it's precisely that notion of a community based on citizenship, which is the central idea there, which I think you usefully bring up. Now, the problem is that all these elements of the idea, the ideology and practice of society as involving a membership in a community equals based on citizenship with certain rights and certain obligations, that's in permanent tension with another crucial aspect of modern society, which is it's also a market society, which both objectively and ideologically is in tension. That's true of the political aspect of citizenship too, but it's certainly true of what we might call the social aspect of citizenship. And what you're tracing is really one aspect of what Polanyi would call the double movement of modernity, in which you have both the consolidation and extension of market society and its ideology. You have counter movements and reactions against it, which, among other things, try to build up forms of community that really affect people's life chances. And then you have periodic reactions against them and resurgences of market ideology, which is what we're living through now. Now, in terms of that, what strikes me is, A, the focus on disability in your paper is interesting in itself. I think it makes for a valid topic. But
I appreciate that.
yeah, no, it does. But on the other hand, it's also misleading because
I was waiting for the second half of the sentence. I didn't want to wait because I thought that the sentence was not going to get any better after that.
No, you were right. Well, no, I bring this up. I mean, this is a part of the sort of thing that, one might also talk about. Disability in the broadest sense is an important topic, but a lot of the social aspect, the whole social aspect of citizenship is full membership in a community involving mutual responsibility, public provision, and so on. It doesn't have to do exclusively with disability, even in the broadest sense. I mean, for Marshall, the idea of the welfare state, which is a bad way to put it, doesn't just mean targeted handouts for undeserving, stigmatized individuals. It means, for Marshall, above all, education is the crucial aspect of the welfare state, and various other things. In some ways, it's interesting that moving back to the focus on disability is probably part of a gradual erosion of the whole ideology of citizenship and this resurgence of a liberal individualistic marketized worldview in which you basically are looking for exceptions to the basic model. Another point that strikes me is that...
I'm still answering that one, Jeff.
Okay, well, let me add one other small one.
I'm going to make it be small, though, because we have other people who still...
This is small, okay. The stuff about independence is very interesting in precisely these terms, because it's an attempt to use liberal individualism or ideology in a kind of jujitsu, but it also has its limitations. I would just say in terms of that, focusing on independence also, it strikes me, focuses it on a principle that has a lot of sway in American society, which is equality of opportunity. And Hayek was one of the ones who thought the idea of equality of opportunity was very dangerous because people would realize you needed to do something concrete to make it happen. But anyway, going back to the previous points, I'll leave it at that.
So, I think this is all great. I don't have a lot to say. I think you're absolutely right. I tend to agree with you that the focus on disability is very much connected to a return to an individualized model, right? I'm not trying to argue for a focus on disability, but just to say that disability has been increasingly an organizing category. Recently, I think you're right, independence is interesting in these terms because it connects to equality of opportunity. And equality of opportunity is another one of these terms that's very politically contestable because it all depends on the framing, right? It all depends on how broad is the transaction in which you're seeking equal opportunity. If you want, so David Strauss, the law professor, has a terrific paper that he wrote 30 years ago called something like The Illusory Distinction Between Equality of Opportunity and Equality of Result, which says, look, if you take equality of opportunity seriously across the entire range of someone's life, you have to provide all of these massive social interventions that are indistinguishable from what people call equality of result. And of course that's right, but of course you can also focus on equality of opportunity once you get to a particular point in your life, and that's what the more conservative or neoliberal components of equality of opportunity talk about. Right, so I think this is all sort of a political effort, and I think you're right to identify kind of the locus of the politics here. Yes?
So I would just like to throw out a term that hasn't been mentioned, but I think it's related to a lot of the points, and that's the notion of incentive, which I think goes along with what Jeff was just saying about market-based society. And it seems to me, if you think of government as basically from a market point of view, as a redistributive system, the question is, are you incentivizing some things you don't want to incentivize? So, for example, dependency. So, just want your response to.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's right. And so what disability promises to do in a market society but fails to do is provide this determinate exception, provide a way of saying we can serve our conscience that makes us not want to leave people destitute without diminishing the incentives that a market society is supposed to provide. And it fails to do that because the disability category is something that itself is very much contested and very dependent on lots of judgments of value. So I think that's sort of another way of identifying the source of the tensions that I'm talking about in the paper. Yeah.
Thanks. I really appreciate this conversation. I come from disability studies in the humanistic and critical social scientific strain, so I am struck by how stable the category of disability is around physical disability, which I guess is not surprising if you're borrowing from legal or activist traditions because they privilege physical disability over invisible disability. But I do wonder,
You said physical disability over and then what was
invisible disability?
Invisible?
Yeah, although I think mental disabilities.
Because physical disability could be invisible too.
Right, exactly. But I'm thinking about mental illness was mentioned briefly, or the fuzziness of felt evidence in the clinic. I'm wondering about, I think that's like a really important distinction to make because we still are troubled by invisible disability seeming not substantiated. You're looked up and down often, and if you don't have, whatever. So, so I'm wondering, what your experience is in seeing invisible disability kind of playing out in rights categories, because it's a theoretical stumbling block in the humanities and disability studies that I think maybe could be illuminated by legal takes.
Yeah, I think that, so it's really interesting, the question about invisible disabilities, and of course there are two different kinds of invisible disabilities. There's invisible disabilities that you can still objectively prove to somebody. So asymptomatic HIV infection is an invisible disability, but you could say, look, here's my HIV status, here's a test. On the other hand, pain is an invisible and also not objectively provable kind of disability, right? And I think those may be different. I mean, so when you think about stigma, right, it's interesting to think about stigma as something that people can't see. Paradigmatically, stigma is something that people see and respond to. When Goffman wrote about stigma, he talked about people with invisible stigmas, people who are discreditable, right? And talked about the way that affects the way people with those kinds of stigmatizing conditions go about their lives. I think you see that very much, but I think that's very much like that's the invisible but objectively provable disability. What's interesting in the category of kind of social welfare is the invisible, not objectively determinable disability, pain, and sometimes mental illness or certain kinds of mental disabilities, which are incredibly stigmatized in significant ways, disbelieved, and it really leads to the concern about incentives being thrown off, people being slothful, people not being deserving. I mean, it's something the law struggles with deeply, and it doesn't have any better answer probably than anybody else than you've come up with. I mean, I hate to say it. Right, I mean, but you see very much the legal and political tension, which was in the early 1980s seeing an explosion of the SSDI roles and SSI roles. The Reagan administration sought to clamp down on pain and on mental illness because they're invisible and not objectively provable. That led to a great political outcry in the Democratic Congress, and those definitions were expanded again. But now, read Nicholas Kristof a year ago talking about how this is malleable. Watch 60 Minutes. We're back in another cycle of people fighting about it. I don't think there's any escape from it. Yeah.
I think this might tie into the last question a little bit, but I'm a lawyer expectation for the question first. I'm just an attorney that offered CLE credits and lunch, so.
I was wondering why so many people came.
Yeah, I'm not exactly conversant in.
Anyway, just an attorney. Thank you.
I feel both welcome and uncomfortable with all the big words that were used today. But what I wanted to ask about was this, and as is sort of predicting the future, or looking into the future a little bit, which is, as we have a generation now of younger people who have more, it appears, or my understanding is more diagnosed learning disabilities, the autism spectrum, things like this that are more, God, I don't know the wrong word, but more diagnosed than they had been in the past, right? Coming into the workforce. With that in mind, I guess, the two thoughts I have in terms of what we've been talking about today is, one, is there either legislation or thought in the legal area of what might happen in the SSDI world in that regard, as depending on in the area of things that aren't seen, that might be more, that people consider more of a gray area where there's more argument about it. So that's one part of it. And the other part of it, going back to the stigma side of this, is whether as those diagnoses become more common and people are growing up today with lots of friends who have a learning disability or are diagnosed with autism somewhere on the spectrum or other similar types of things, whether there is a sense or a feeling in the academic world that, based on that contact, there might be a softening of some of the stigmas around those issues and more generally around the terminology or a diagnosis of someone being disabled in
Yeah, so those are great questions, and I'm not sure I have terrific answers. I mean, what you are seeing is a generation of people as diagnoses for various kinds of so-called hidden disabilities that are mental, like learning disabilities, some of which can be quite objectively established, some of which are not established as objectively, like autism. All these different kinds of disabilities exploding in diagnosis, if not in prevalence, and people. Now, a generation after the adoption of the ADA, a couple of generations after the adoption of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, being very rights conscious in a way that they might not have been a generation or two ago. What does that do for all these disability issues? And I think it's a really great question. I don't have a terrific answer to that. I think a lot of people are wondering. I can say. Both in my work doing disability rights enforcement and as a professor, I see lots of learning disability issues and ADHD and various learning disabilities. And I think there's much more attentiveness to those kinds of accommodations in schools, including in higher education, including in very elite higher education than there used to be. And I wonder what happens in the workplace where I think there's much less willingness to provide accommodations for those disabilities. To me, that's going to be the conflict we're going to see over that. And then, if that leads to people not getting jobs they think they should get, or washing out jobs that they should be accommodated in and flourish in, I think that may lead down the line to conflicts over Social Security type, and welfare type programs. But I think we're just at the start of that, and so I don't think we've seen much yet.
the two in case we ran over. The expectation when we changed this time is that it would be up to 1:30. We have room.
Nancy wants to get her last.
Your professional opinion as an attorney about the ADA Amendment Act, whether that's really sufficiently tightened up the loopholes to prevent courts from siding with employers in cases that you're talking about.
So that is a really great question. I mean, it's early yet to see, right, because it takes a long time for cases to work their way through. So we're just seeing the first set of cases, for the last year or a year and a half. And you're seeing a lot more cases get past the question of who has a disability than before. So that's good. I mean, cases aren't getting knocked out before they get to the question of whether the employer has discriminated. It's not as clear, and there's some, it's hard to tell. Nobody's done a very careful study of published and unpublished decisions, but it's not as clear that courts aren't finding another way to rule against the plaintiffs, right? So they say, okay, fine, you have a disability, but it wasn't reasonable to provide the accommodation you requested. There's some troubling, from my perspective, evidence that that's what courts are doing. That it's really that courts didn't like these cases. Federal district judges, they don't like employment discrimination cases. They really don't like disability cases. They were looking for a way to clear them off their docket, saying the plaintiff didn't have a disability was easy, given what the Supreme Court said. Now it's not so easy, given the ADA Amendments Act, they find another way. That could be what's happening. A lot more cases are proceeding farther. It probably gives plaintiffs more settlement leeway. That's all good, from the perspective of enforcing the ADA. But probably, I will guess 10 years from now we'll find it wasn't a sea change in the law. It was a change. It improved success rates. ADA employment claims were the second least successful class of cases in federal court, behind only prisoner petitions. And now they might end up fourth or fifth. It would be my guess, but I don't really know.
I have one last.
Oh, please. We have the room till 2.
That's okay. I guess it's kind of a big question, but I found myself as I was reading really wondering where we should be drawing the boundaries between old age, disability, and illness/infirmity.
Yep.
Because those are all such crucial concepts for how we construct a welfare state. And I think a lot of the political action goes in where we draw those boundaries. And so I wonder, as an advocate, where you would want to see those boundaries drawn. Or, so part of what you said earlier today made me think, well, you just want to erase some of those boundaries altogether and say, well, old age and disability are really the same thing. But that's sort of a transparent attempt to, gain sympathy for disabled people by making them look more like old people. So.
Well, there are two things, actually. The two pieces of that. And actually, so this is, I could, if I remove my shirt, I'd show you scars I have from fights over this category in my activist role, because, and this set of categories, because, what a lot of people in the disability rights movement say is if only the elderly advocates would see themselves as disabled, that would be a really good thing. And so you'll find AARP is always incredibly supportive of disability rights issues, because at the institutional level they sort of get that. But this plays out in lots of different ways. One way is getting sympathy from the political system, but another way is in terms of kind of the principles and orientation. So the disability rights movement tends to be a big, complex movement. There are a lot of people, a lot of different views, but tends to be focused on issues of integration. So we want to make sure that people with disabilities, if they're getting housing paid for by Medicaid, the housing is right along Walnut Street or whatever. It's with everybody else. You have an opportunity to have dinner with who you want to have dinner with, go to bed when you want to go to bed. Nursing home, bad, bad, bad. Assisted living, problematic, because it's like 800 people who all live in some suburb somewhere where they have to take a bus with a bunch of other people who live there to go do anything in the world. Whereas the dominant way of thinking about those kinds of issues from the perspective of the elderly community is assisted living, good, right? And so you have real fights just about the way these different movements or groups of people conceptualize themselves and their goals, right? But it's all the same. It's ultimately the same kinds of questions. So I think it's all about the political contestation around that. So for my illness. What's the line between illness, infirmity, and disability? it's whatever you want it to be. I mean, a disability is an illness that goes on for long enough that we call it a disability, is one way of thinking about it. And I think, these are very much lines that are politically contested, and I think they're contested, based in part on people's conceptions of their own identities and in part on what they think it will buy them to collapse or divide the different groups politically. All right, so we have, so we still have time.
Keep going on one more question.
I'm looking at my watch, so I said, yes. We'll make this the last question.
So we talked a lot about kind of the easing of conscience of our in providing these benefits. But I wonder if there's been much in the way of proponents using an argument that there's an economic benefit to everyone in providing disability benefits and insurance and rights because there's just added economic stability, which benefits businesses and individuals, because otherwise everyone has to save up and lock up a bunch of resources because, well, what if? And if we always have this level of rights that exist, then you just have a freer economy with more resources going around it in circulation. Have you ever seen that as part of it?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a huge set of arguments in kind of American social welfare in general right now. Very attractive set of arguments on kind of the center left are those kind of arguments. Among disability rights advocates, I think what you see, the version of that argument you see is tied up in the colloquy I had with Amy before, which is, and Nancy said earlier, which is, look, we all could be disabled at any time. And so we want to have, so sort of just expressing that sense of solidarity in the sense of we are all equally vulnerable to disability. But I don't think it's ever framed in that economic, it allows people to take risks in their lives because they know they don't have to save up the huge emergency fund or they, whatever. I mean, that is a very powerful, like you read Democracy Journal, and I read that article in Democracy Journal about social welfare stuff generally. But in the disability world, they don't talk about it that way, in the same way. But I think it fits well. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Help yourself to any remaining food, and if you want to be on our mailing list to get ongoing announcements, we have a sign-up sheet as well as our annual schedule in the back.